the startup going on, right? With your sports and your student athletes, there's a lot going on in your schedule. So what we've done is we wanted to provide an opportunity to allow you all to still engage in discussion with one another, to be able to talk about some of the content that we're going to bring you each workshop. But also we wanted to reserve some time in the fact that you all have other things that you're going to need to step into regarding your schedule. So the way that we're going to format this, if you notice, and just a quick disclaimer, that we're going to record this first part of the conversation when we bring you the content. So Stephen and I are going to share some content with you on the topic that we'll be discussing. And then what we'll do is the content we'll share with you will be for 1 hour. So we're just going to bring you some content, some conversation, some things to think about for the first hour. That piece will be recorded so that if folks want to refer to the recording later or review this content we're sharing, you can do that. We'll provide the recording. And then what we'll do is at about 12 o'clock, we'll pivot to 2 breakout rooms. And Stephen and I will both split up those breakout rooms. And we will be having an opportunity for all of us to talk during that time about where we are with the content, our own experiences, and Stephen and I are going to give you some tips and tools that might be helpful in your future discussions about these topics that we bring to you today. So we understand that a few of you need to transition out of here at either the 12 o'clock mark or some of you even a little earlier, to which we understand that and appreciate you. That's why we're recording the lesson, so you'll still have access to the content. For those of you who are remaining at the 12 o'clock hour, you'll join us into the breakout rooms for some light discussion around the topic. Does that sound all right to everyone? All right, perfect.
Dr. Mexico, I have a question for you.
Sure,
will
Coach
the
Sheffield.
breakout sessions, will they be recorded?
Zoom typically won't record the breakout sessions for us. That's a really good question. So we'll have the recording of the content, but the breakout sessions will not be recorded.
Yeah, perfect. We want to appreciate and respect folks' privacy and their willingness to share. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you. And what I'll do is I'll send a reminder to folks. And when we break out into the breakout rooms, I'll go ahead and turn off that record button. Okay. All right. Awesome. Thank you all so much. Thank you for the reminder. So without further ado, we're looking forward to this conversation. Thank you for the 2 hours you're giving us, or the time that you have. We also wish you well in the beginning of your camps and practices and getting folks ready for competition. That sounds super excited. You've made us beach fans, and so we're cheering for you. So we want you to go on and do that good work. So Stephen, would you like to get us kicked off with the content for this afternoon or for this morning?
Yeah. We were sort of really wrestling about where we would go with our conversation today, and one of my default go-tos is although I don't have much left, but I like to hang out at good conversation at the barbershop. So you find out where things are. You get to hear the lay of the land, and interestingly enough, there was some good conversation in and around the area of, we got into this conversation about vaccines, right? And you had competing schools of thought. You had, that group that's like, nah, I'm not trusting that. I'm waiting. I don't care what you do. That's too soon. And then you have the school of thought of people that are like, hey, I need to get this because I want my life back, right? Both have some great merits. Both have some really great points. But like how, my question was, how did people arrive at the stances that they arrived at, right? So we were talking and going back and forth, and even within my own household, I got people that at varying points of, view on that continuum. So I know that as coaches and working with athletics, there's conversation in and around student athletes and being vaccinated. Some are at varying points on that continuum as well. I'm sure coaches are probably at varying points on that continuum. So I wanted to kind of talk about that and give you some opportunity to sort of flush some of these things out as well, because I think this is an ongoing conversation. A lot of times where you walk away with more questions than answers. All right. So we were discussing it, and I thought it would be a great topic of discussion to bring to the group, because I think it's pertinent and it's really kind of apropos for where we are right now. And so the thing that kind of resonated with me that I wanted to kind of kick us off today with was the word trust. And I think that is a very loaded term. You hear a lot of times. I think I heard it put best: that trust is something that takes a lifetime to build, but a moment to break, right? And trust is a personal thing for people. And you get people on this. I keep going back to that continuum, but people at various places on that continuum with their trust for things like the government, their trust for things like the FDA, or all things in and around health, welfare of citizens. Because going back to that comment that we made about being a snapshot or a movie, there are groups and populations of people that have an ongoing movie of situations and things that have happened that have caused them to be extremely mistrustful of the government, extremely mistrustful of, for example, law enforcement, extremely mistrustful of, as they used to say back in the 70s, the man. Whatever the man was, you don't trust the man. Anybody that represents the man, that's who you need to be fearful of, right? And it was it's kind of one of those things. And I talk to students all the time about, honestly, in other countries, the government is afraid of its citizens, right? And afraid of the people. In the US, the people and the citizens are afraid of the government. Right, so it's like a total paradigm shift here. People are you go to the door and the FBI is standing at the door, you're scared, right? You get a letter from the IRS, your heart beats, it skips a beat, So we are sort of instinctively taught to be fearful and nervous of government interaction, to say the least. So today we wanted to kind of delve into that a little bit. I'm gonna share my screen. And hopefully we can kind of talk about this and flush some of this out as a group. And I wanted to preface it with, by no means are we coming into this thing as we're the experts and we talk, you listen. But I just wanted to give us some talking points and some things for us to consider as we move into these breakouts. And then, hopefully we can arrive at our own places of thought for this thing together. So let me share my screen, and then we'll jump right in. All right. Can everybody see my screen okay? I think so. Hoping so. Yes. All right. Perfect. First off, I wanted to kind of delve into how and why certain groups of people, for example, originally got to this place of just being, mistrustful of government entities or questioning of motives or anything like that, because there's always been a sentiment of wondering, well, is what we're being told true? I mean, in this society now, we hear terms like fake news. So everybody questions everything. You're taught to question. I was even told in school, believe, none of what you hear and only half of what you see. Right. So what's your angle? Right. And I was always sort of brought into that premise. So if anyone is familiar with this gentleman, and you may not be, but I wanted to share, at least start about experimentation in this country and how it sort of came to be, and how and why it's a really complicated issue in terms of where people are on this continuum, depending upon what their frame of reference may be or what their family of origins history may be in and around this. So I'm gonna see if I can get this going. Hold on just a second.
You know, I'm not sure if that hyperlink is.
Yeah, I may have to stop sharing and go.
Yeah.
To the other side. It'll come up.
I'm not sure if that hyperlink will work. You want me to bring up the video?
Yeah, if you can, because I think my
I'll go ahead and share the video. I've got it set up here.
yeah, my wheel is just sort of rotating now.
No worries, no worries. Can folks see the YouTube screen that's up on the
Yeah, we got you.
All right, beautiful. All right, I'll go ahead and start this one off.
At the edge of Central Park in Manhattan, there's a bronze statue of a doctor named James Marion Sims, whose brilliant achievement carried the fame of American surgery throughout the entire world. He's the guy who created the vaginal speculum, an instrument gynecologists use for examination. He pioneered the surgical repair for fistula, a complication from childbirth, and became known as the father of modern gynecology. But that brilliant achievement was the result of a series of excruciating experimental surgeries that he conducted on enslaved women. In a lot of ways, Sims epitomizes the story of American medicine for Black women. It's a system that's failing them to this day. From infant mortality to life expectancy, the racial disparities in healthcare are staggering. The gulf between Black and white might be widest when we look at maternal mortality, with Black women 3 to 4 times more likely to die in connection with pregnancy or birth than white women. And that divide can be traced back to doctors like Sims, who contributed to a long, largely overlooked history of institutional racism in medicine.
Trying to understand a historical problem without knowing its history is like trying to treat a patient without eliciting a thorough medical history. You're doomed to failure.
That's Harriet Washington, a medical ethicist and author who chronicled the intersection of race and medicine in her book, Medical Apartheid. While many of the stark racial disparities in healthcare can be attributed to environmental and economic factors like access to good healthcare, studies show that minority patients tend to receive a lower quality of care than non-minorities, even when they have the same types of health insurance or the same ability to pay for care.
As African Americans, we've been abused for so long, consistently by the system. Why should we trust it? Why should we go to it when ill? And that's iatrophobia. That's a fear of the healer, inculcated by the behavior of those healers, unfortunately.
It starts with slavery. Doctors relied on slave owners for financial stability. They accompanied plantation masters to auctions to verify the fitness of slaves and were called in to treat sick slaves to protect their owners' investments. In 1807, Congress abolished the importation of slaves and in turn pushed Black women to have more children, to essentially breed slaves. Founding Father Thomas Jefferson later wrote, "I consider a woman who brings a child every 2 years as more profitable than the best man on the farm." Around the 1830s, the abolitionist movement led to the rise of what was called Negro medicine, or efforts to identify Black inferiority to justify slavery. And there were polygenists who tried to use both science and the Bible to find proof that races evolve from different origins. The 1830s also marked the beginning of recorded experimentation on Black women's bodies. One doctor performed experimental C-sections on slaves. Another one perfected the dangerous ovariotomy, or removal of an ovary by testing the procedure on slave women. In fact, half the original articles in the 1836 Southern Medical and Surgical Journal dealt with experiments on Black people. And then, of course, there was James Marion Sims, whose reputation is etched in history and on that statue in Central Park. Between 1845 and 1849, Sims began performing experimental surgeries on a 17-year-old slave named Anarcha. He eventually performed 30 operations on Anarcha and more surgeries on about 11 other female slaves. When his male colleagues could no longer bear to assist him in inflicting pain on the women, the slaves took turns restraining one another. Yet paintings depicting Sims, Anarcha, and other slave women presented a subdued version of his experiments. Even though anesthesia was introduced in 1846, Sims chose not to use it for his experimentation with slaves. His practices echoed one of the most prevalent and dangerous beliefs in medicine at the time, that Black people did not feel pain or anxiety. This book from 1851, titled The Natural History of Human Species, claimed the American dark races bear with indifference tortures insupportable to a white man. Studies released as recently as last year demonstrate that Black people are less likely to be treated for pain, particularly in the ER. There's even one from a children's hospital that found the same to be true for kids. And just this year, Pearson Education, a leading educational publisher, issued an apology and recalled nursing textbooks that included racist stereotypes, like this section that said Black people often report higher pain intensity than other cultures.
Well, what does it mean when you say that someone doesn't feel pain? Among other things, you're speaking about their humanity. These are all part of that suite of beliefs emanating from the 19th century that we still have not shaken off. Despite all our knowledge and sophistication, they're deeply ingrained.
Doctors like Sims might fit the Dr. Frankenstein stereotype, but they weren't outliers. Historically, Southern doctors who used Black bodies for troubling experiments were the norm.
It's a very common question. How can we judge our forebears? You know, those guys in the 18th century who practiced medicine in a way that appalls us today. You know, we think, how could you do that? I did not judge the practitioners based on our own ethics. I judged them based on the ethics of their time. It was not acceptable back then. We just did not hear from the people who protested against it.
After the Civil War ended, the 1900s brought a wave of immigrants to the U.S. It sparked a race panic and coincided with the birth of the American Eugenics Movement. One of the movement's key objectives was to reduce the childbearing potential of the poor and disabled. Leaders included birth control pioneer and Planned Parenthood founder Margaret Sanger, who eventually devised the controversial Negro Project, or family planning centers that pushed birth control in the Black South. It was a project that even garnered support from W.E.B. Du Bois, a founder of the NAACP, who wrote that Black people bred carelessly and disastrously. By the mid-1930s, more than half the states passed pro-sterilization laws, and often sterilization was forced. In 1961, future civil rights leader Fannie Lou Hamer went to the hospital to have a tumor removed, but was subjected to a hysterectomy without consent. The procedure, which rendered women infertile without their knowledge, was so common in the South that Hamer is said to have dubbed it the Mississippi appendectomy.
African American babies were no longer economically valuable. And African Americans themselves had gone from being a resource to a nuisance.
In June of 1973, the SPLC uncovered 100 to 150,000 cases of women who had been sterilized with federal funds in Alabama. Half the women were Black. In recent decades, women of color continue to be exposed to dubious reproductive health programs. In December 1990, the FDA approved a contraceptive called Norplant, and it was selectively marketed to Black teenagers in Baltimore schools.
You know, one of the current birth control methods now in the United States is Norplant.
Norplant fans like David Duke, the former KKK Grand Wizard, even introduced legislation to give women on welfare an annual reward of $100 if they agreed to get Norplant.
And it's time we start to encourage welfare mothers to be responsible.
That bill never passed, but the implant ignited a debate on whether long-term contraception, like Norplant that lasted 5 years, could be used as a form of social engineering when pushed to specific communities. Today, as we continue to lose Black mothers at alarming rates, a deeper look at the past may be a good step towards creating a more equitable healthcare system. Hi guys, thanks for watching. Of course,
All right.
Let's get back to where we were. All right. Now, taking that as a backdrop, it's important to know that, especially during the South, in the South and in a lot of African American homes, there's it's considered like the art of storytelling, right? A lot of the history, and I think it originally began because it was historically forbidden and against the law to teach African Americans or the slaves during that time to read or be educated. So the only way of sort of passing down history and passing down things that they wanted future generations to remember was through the art of storytelling. So as you can see, they're rooted in oral cultures and traditions, and therefore they have admired good stories and good storytellers. The better you were at that, the more likely you were to be considered one of the elders of your community that was sort of responsible for keeping a lot of the stories and the things that were considered priceless for that community. With that being said, going into some of the stories that have essentially been passed down from generation to generation, one of the things that we heard a lot about as a kid was the Tuskegee Experiment. There was actually a movie that came out some time later, but the Tuskegee Experiment is basically a syphilis study. To give you the nuts and bolts of it was, they primarily worked with African-American men during the 30s. They identified these men that had tested positive for syphilis, and basically had them a part of this study that kept them for almost 40 years. And they studied them and they tracked them, and they gave them basically medicine, which turned out later to be just placebos and water pills and sugar pills and things like that, essentially to see what would happen if syphilis was left untreated and what damage it could potentially do to the body long term, right? The only issue with this was there was a cure that had been already discovered for syphilis probably 10 years in, maybe even before the study was completed, but that was denied these men. And most of these men died horrible deaths. They went blind. They had all kinds of other issues that manifested themselves later. And it wasn't until decades and decades later that it was discovered that this was even being done. This was done sort of under the guise of helping this community. And these people trusted that the Tuskegee Institute was moving and operating with their best interest in mind, only to find out, decades later that it was not. So this is one of the landmark experiments that really resonated with people of color, and was one of the stories that have been passed down from generation to generation. A second was the CDC study of the MMR vaccines. Earlier this year, reports even emerged that the CDC was hiding results from the test of experimental measles vaccines that it actually increased the likelihood of Black children developing autism. So yet again, it was for many people, it was almost considered confirmation. And for others, it was sort of shocking. So it kind of goes back to that snapshot versus that movie narrative that we've been discussing. Another would be, if you're not familiar with the story of Henrietta Lacks. Henrietta Lacks' cells were cloned back in the 1950s, but this removal was done without her knowledge and without her consent. It was discovered that she had what was called an immortal cell or a HeLa cell that researchers have now roughly grown more than 20 tons of her cells since her death. In addition to harvesting her cells without her permission, they also published the family's medical records without their consent as well. And to this day, neither Ms. Lacks nor her estate, who she's since passed away, or her family has ever even been compensated for the use of her cells and what was done under the guise of experimentation and furthering medical exploration and improving medicine that we use today. Sarah Barton who is another famous case. This was basically the story of a Kikoi woman who was put on display across Europe and really sort of used as more of a freak show attraction. And it was primarily due to her body and her sexual organs, and people marveled at what she presented, which was so different from what they were typically used to seeing. And after, she died, researchers kept her sexual organs, her brain, and put them on display at a famous museum in Paris. But this is just further evidence of how minority groups in this country have always been essentially seen as property and not so much as human beings. So whatever was done to them could be essentially justified in that same vein. The other area that I think it was extremely interesting. Antonio, do you have this video? If I can.
Yep, I have this video queued up.
All right, perfect. It's Cointelpro. Cointelpro was essentially a program that was implemented by the United States government, more importantly, the FBI, which aimed at surveilling, infiltrating, discrediting, and disrupting domestic American political organizations. And primarily, they focused on civil rights organizations like the Black Panthers, primarily Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, the Nation of Islam, the American Indian movement, or even independence movements such as the Puerto Rican independence movement, groups like the Young Lords. And these were all groups that were considered threats to what they called the US democracy at the time. And at one point in time, J. Edgar Hoover, who was the director of the FBI, said that the Black Panthers were the largest threat to American democracy during that time. And during this process, he called for them to be surveilled and essentially neutralized. But I'll show that we have a quick video clip to kind of give you some insight into the depths of this one as well. I'll stop sharing then.
All right, absolutely. And then folks, one thing that we also wanted to point out too that was so powerful was in the last film that you saw, it noted the eugenics movement that existed here in the United States. One thing to keep in mind is when we're talking about the eugenics movement that existed here, similar acts occurred throughout Europe, but particularly during World War II by Nazi Germany. So the eugenics movement, the process of those in power, utilizing those who had been subjugated, in this case, Jews in death camps, all right, were experimented upon in order to breed out the Jewish race and in order to increase the volume of births that aligned with the Aryan race that was believed to be at the time. So this eugenics movement, this history of utilizing experimentation from those in power on those who have been subjugated has been a worldwide phenomena that sometimes folks think, well, it just occurred in Europe, but no, it actually occurred here in the United States quite frequently. And it wasn't uncommon that if a mother gave birth to a child who had disabilities, the child in the late 1800s, early 1900s was actually taken from the mother without consent and then given to the state to take care of. So just some thoughts there. But anyway, yes, Stephen, I'll go ahead and play that video.
Okay. We'll do.
Great, here it goes.
The report identified Black identity extremists as a threat to law enforcement. Critics say the report is eerily similar to the FBI's 20th century counterintelligence program.
Cointelpro was an FBI operation established in the 50s by J. Edgar Hoover to target African Americans who were fighting for justice and equality. He targeted Dr. King, he targeted Malcolm X, and over 80% of the targets of Cointelpro were members of the Black Panther Party.
At the height of Cointelpro, activists and community organizers were targeted. These include current Congressional Black Caucus members like John Lewis, Bobby Rush, Emmanuel Cleaver, and Barbara Lee.
The church committee in the mid-70s held hearings and determined that many of the actions and activities of Cointelpro were really unconstitutional.
What you've described is a series of illegal actions intended squarely to deny First Amendment rights to some Americans. How shall we ensure that it never happen again?
One of the similarities that I see are that it's based on race. You know, Cointelpro definitely targeted African Americans. Black identity extremists, which Attorney General Jeff Sessions has put out, targets African Americans. When it was brought to our attention, we immediately contacted the FBI director and had a very forthright meeting. I specifically asked him, how do they identify Black identity extremists? Who are they? And there was no answer to that. We still don't know who's a Black identity extremist.
A lot of activists around the country are very concerned that we're getting ready to repeat a very sad chapter of our history, where people who are rightfully protesting what they consider to be an injustice in their community, which is their relationship with police officers, are now being targeted and labeled as extremists and are going through periods of surveillance and harassment.
As a community worker, I attended many Black Panther Party functions. I was part of the breakfast program. We registered many people, the African American community and others, to vote. Well, the FBI during COINTELPRO would try to turn members of the Black Panther Party against each other. Agent provocateurs were placed within the party to try to sow dissent.
I was the coordinator of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party. In December 4th, 1969, Fred Hampton and Mark Clark, two members of the Black Panther Party, were murdered. And they put an informant, William O'Neill, planted him inside the Panther Party.
Understood, Fred, that we are dedicated, that his life wasn't given in vain.
The national director of the FBI said that the Black Panther Party was the #1 threat to national security of this nation. And that created the condition for law enforcement agents all across this nation to go after Panthers. That program that they did, in some sense, we ought to be thankful for, because that put in writing for everybody to see we're still in the eyes of so many, nothing but a bunch of work. Was I surprised? No. I fully expected it to happen. Now the question is, how do we deal with it?
People need to get to their members of Congress and get them a copy of this report and hold their members of Congress accountable. In this day and time, they could really stop and halt the progressive movements that are taking place in the country. And I think with Black Lives Matter, with the Dreamers, with all of our millennials and what they're doing, they deserve to be out there and to protest and to engage in petitioning their government to right the wrongs of the past. Those of us who've been around, who saw COINTELPRO, really know the risks and the dangers, and so I hope that people really believe us that this happened, because this is COINTELPRO 2.0.
With the top-rated app.
Okay.
Back to share my screen. All right, Antonio, just wanted to give you an opportunity here.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So what Stephen and I wanted to just kind of bring, right, is by no means do we consider ourselves experts in this arena, but what we wanted to do was just share a little more insight into the weight that is carried upon the shoulders, not only of individuals, but large groups of individuals who have experienced high levels of trauma on a systemic level for a sustained period of time. In other words, the more a system begins to act out or oppress a larger group through its systems, like the medical system, education, whatever the case is, what that group experiences are actually what research is indicating: psychological, social, and physiological impacts for generations to come. Not just for the individuals who lived through those traumatic episodes, but through the transferring of their children through notions of storytelling, but also through lifestyle. So as Stephen mentioned, the cultural norm of storytelling in African culture, this is something that is also a cultural norm in other indigenous populations, such as Native Americans, as well as also some Latinx or Latino populations. Many of you may know this if you've been in a Latino household, and after dinner, what do? You all sit down, and usually after you've had that big meal, one of the elders in the family just starts telling a story. And it happens so organically, right? It's something that happens where no one says, sit down, everyone, it's story time. The elder doesn't say, gather around children. But what happens is everyone gravitates towards one of the elders in the family. And the elder just starts telling stories in such cases of growing up in Mexico and coming to the United States and what that was like. And that is where some of the trauma is transferred from one generation to the next through natural communication means of families and cultures. We call this, the technical term, the academic term for it, right, is generational trauma. And sometimes you'll hear the term, in addition to generational trauma, you'll hear a term like multi-generational trauma, intergenerational trauma, or transgenerational trauma. But really what we're talking about here is a legacy of loss of large groups of people, right? That's really what we're talking about, is for generations' lives that have been impacted negatively on a systemic level. And so there's been a ton of research in addition to all of the evidence that Stephen shared with us about the oppression and discriminatory practices of individuals of color in our country. But in addition to that, research saying what has happened then when we follow generations of those that have been oppressed in these ways, what happens to these individuals? Well, the research that is gathering both in the behavioral sciences and in what we call the hard sciences, right, in neuroscience and the physical sciences, indicate that psychological, social, and physiological impacts on these populations are high, okay? Now, typically when we're looking at large populations, what we're looking at are populations that have previously been exposed to enslavement. So that would be African Americans in this country, in addition to Native populations. Like some of us may know that the missions, the 21 missions that were built in California, was a systemic effort by Spain to secure the West Coast from future invaders or other countries, such as Germany, coming in because they took an interest in California and all the resources. And Spain said, if we don't do anything with this land, we're going to lose it. So they built the missions and enslaved Native Americans to build the missions, okay? So when we talk about enslaved populations, that's one group that has experienced high levels of trauma. Survivors of genocide, so Holocaust survivors, would be another, right? And obviously refugees coming to one country, in this case, the United States, from others, is another population that we examine closely in research to see what is the multi-generational impact of trauma. The top two reasons why most refugees come to a country and flee their country of origin is usually two things: starvation or genocide. So individuals are looking to either just try to survive by feeding themselves, or they're looking to escape murder. Those levels of trauma are high in those groups. And so we see symptoms emerge not only within one generation, but through multiple subsequent generations. So through research, a couple of the things, and I put the, if you notice the sources up here, if you'd like to check these out for yourselves later, but systemic injustices, all right, breed this notion of mistrust within individuals. And then when we engage in communication and storytelling and experiences with one another, that mistrust can transfer from one generation to the next, like Stephen was saying. And so what we see, though, the symptoms of generational trauma can include things that we see in all of these populations on the left, right, that I just mentioned, things like low birth weight, higher rates of morbidity, which means decreased lifespan, right? You don't live as long generally. Chronic health conditions, including type 2 diabetes, that should be respiratory conditions and cardiovascular disease, things like high blood pressure, right? All of that, cholesterol. And then we start to see increased cortisol levels. Cortisol is that stress hormone. That's the nickname for it. But what we also see is that when you're exposed to high levels of cortisol in the brain, it changes the brain function. This is where we start to see folks develop high blood sugar levels. all of these things we also know can be passed down from one generation to the next through our genes. So things like hyper-awareness, anxiety, depression, substance dependency can be transferred down from one generation to the next, as well as certain types of mental health diagnoses. Perhaps one of the most amazing breakthroughs that we're seeing, and also disturbing in a way through the research, when examining levels or populations of people who have experienced high levels of trauma, are also what are referred to as epigenetic mutations. Literally, our gene structure changes in generations that have experienced high levels of systemic trauma. So this stress-related gene here, the FKBP5 gene, is also linked to diagnoses related to PTSD and depression. So we wanted to kind of just share this with you because we know that we've been hearing so much about vaccines, and we've been hearing so much about where we all are personally within our personal lives, our families, right? I'm not sure if some of you are aware, but even within like the Latino community, and some of you may be aware of this, there's an ongoing debate just between the vaccine getting it, but there's also a debate about which vaccine you would get if you were going to get the vaccine. So like even within my own family, there's a discussion right now. Some folks say, I don't want the vaccine. Other folks are saying in the Latino community, we're only interested in the Moderna vaccine. And where that's coming from is some folks have looked, again, my job's not a medical doctor, right? To refer you to which vaccine to get if you're interested. These are the discussions though taking place, is some folks are saying, look, when we're looking at the research, the Pfizer vaccine has higher rates of allergic reactions and side effects in Latinos. And they're saying if we are already prone as a Latino population to diabetes, obesity, heart disease, things like this, we don't want the additional complications. So some folks are saying, look, I only want the Moderna, which in some cases is leading to a delay in vaccines because some communities are looking and saying, well, I'm only offered Pfizer, so I'm going to wait until I can get the Moderna. So these are just the current conversations that are kind of going on. I'm sure many of you have been aware of these, right? And so we wanted to just provide this background information as to where some of these perceptions come from. So Stephen, thank you for showing that slide there.
No problem, man. Now we're at our breakout session. So I wanted to take a moment to sort of just prime you and prep you with kind of what we'll be going into during that time. We're looking at, number one, taking the history of mistrust of the government by minority groups into account. How can we better support our student athletes in their decision-making around issues like vaccines, right? What kinds of things would be important to discuss with them? What kinds of things would be important to share? And more importantly, how do we plan on moving differently as a result? And I think those are two prevailing questions that I think athletic departments all over the country should be wrestling with and talking about. So I welcome the thought of having these conversations, and I know in athletics, we are having those conversations because the ticker tape down below, it's kind of minimal, but you're always seeing, oh, this group of athletes got COVID. 5 members from this team got COVID. 10 members of this team got COVID. This game is postponed due to COVID. COVID protocol, it's running rampant. And I think what's probably spurred me more than anything is I was just recently watching a documentary on Real Sports, and they had student athletes that had never recovered, right, that had never been able to compete again after having COVID. And these were, ironically, all female student athletes. And they had contracted it 8 to 9 months earlier and had still not been able to resume competing because of lingering issues. So it kind of further alarmed, I know, myself and my daughter who plays volleyball, and thinking about all these things. So as we move into this, serving with that information sort of serving as the backdrop, I'd love to kind of have us sort of wrestle and come to some candid conversations about how we can not only support our athletes, but arrive at our own conclusions about where we are with this information. So let's tell you what, do you want to just, so we decided we would split randomly, if that's okay. And we'll just split the room into 2 groups. So it'll roughly be about 32 or so per each. Is that all right with you, Antonio?
Absolutely. I can get that going. And what we'll do, folks, is when we break into those rooms, then Stephen will be in one room, I'll be in the other, and we can go through the content. We'll just chat, right? Just have a discussion about how we're processing all of this and what does this mean for our work with student athletes and each other, right, as we move forward. And then what we'll do is probably, I understand some of you have to head out to practices as well, right? So we're aware of that. So I understand that completely. Let me do this just so I remember too, Stephen, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording here.
Yeah.
So I don't forget. All right, let me do that.